Okay, cool. Oh, and this works. So I guess I should introduce myself first. I'm Matthew Barnett. I work for an organization called Epoch AI, and we're essentially a forecasting organization, but we're just trying to forecast the future of AI. Not necessarily in terms of like when it'll arrive, although that's important, but all the various details about AI, like what form will it take? Maybe we'll move into a new paradigm. How could we know that? What impacts will AI have on the world? And also just questions that are related to things that people really care about, like the questions that feed into, will AI kill everyone? I mean, that's a thing on everyone's mind. So if you have some sort of model of why AI will kill everyone, then at Epoch, we're trying to see, well, is there some way of making this model testable? Like, can we make it, a little more precise, a little more rigorous, and try to see if we can come up with actual evidence to test this model that feeds into your probability of us all dying? Okay, so also just feeds into things like how important is it to fund this type of AI safety research, whatever. So very general agenda at Epoch. But I want to say that I think one of the things about our research is that part of doing it requires acknowledging that we have uncertainty in the first place. Like, I think a lot of people who are into AI will be very confident about various future scenarios. Like, they'll say, that'll be this agent that will just recursively self-improve, and it'll be this very powerful, almost like a god, and then it'll impose its will on the world. And they say, the only thing, well, this is kind of a straw man, but the only thing I don't know is when it'll happen. Okay, well, I mean, that's one perspective. Maybe that's right. But I don't actually think that many of the stories that people give about how the future of AI will go, and also the future in general, maybe some people have the right idea, but I'm very uncertain. I don't know how all of this will turn out. So I really want to just get a sense of what's going to happen. If you look at historically, before the deep learning era, people had a very different sense of how AI would go. I mean, most people, I think, sort of thought of it as maybe would be similar to good old-fashioned AI, be more similar to programmers actually programming the AI in C++ or C or something. And then even as recently as, say, 2018, I don't think many people were talking about language models. I think that the sense I got when talking to people about what would AGI look like is it'll be some sort of deep reinforcement learning setup where we train it in some sort of simulated environment and it becomes intelligence, or it becomes intelligent. And so I think it's interesting that people's views about how these things can change so much over time. So if you just extrapolate that forward, I think that it's likely that our views about what AI will look like will continue to change as we get closer. So it's just like a starting point. I think that one of the most important things about AI is just, well, what will the magnitude of the impact be of AI? There's sort of two frameworks, I think, that are mainstream, or one of them's mainstream, maybe the other is not. But some people think of it as just like another technology. So just, we had planes, we had nuclear energy, we had microwaves, and now in the 2020s we're getting AI, and it'll just be this thing that carries us, carries the GDP growth so that it stays at 3% or 2% or whatever. It'll just carry us forward, just like the internet did. But there's this whole other group of people who think that no, that's radically underestimating the impact of the technology. So how can we actually resolve the disagreement between these two people, or like these two camps? So one thing that Epoch cares a lot about is trying to just come up with a model of, well, what is the primary impact of AI likely to be? And how can we actually like think about that in some sort of empirically grounded framework? So we've already borrowed a lot of the work from economists here, which is just to think about economic growth and thinking about, well, the primary point of like developing a technology is to develop new goods and services to make people more productive. And so what are these standard models of economic growth? Say that if you have a certain amount of labor input and a certain amount of capital input, then that will produce a certain amount of economic output. And then each year, we get more efficient at labor and we get more efficient at capital because of technological innovation. So what's interesting is that, and we are like trying to make this case currently, like Epoch just published a thing on like a paper analyzing the arguments here. But it seems that if you just assume in these standard economic models that AI, at some point, there'll be something that can substitute for human labor, then effectively this means that the economy can grow way faster. And the reason is because currently economic growth is bottlenecked by the growth rate of the population. The population cannot grow faster than about 1 to 2% a year, or like 5%. So that plausibly explains why the current economic growth rate is around 3% a year. But if you can just manufacture new AIs in the same way, or in the same way that you can manufacture any other thing, like any other computer hardware, and this can actually give you an increase in the total number of workers, then essentially all of these standard economic models say that the growth rate of the economy will accelerate dramatically, like more than an order of magnitude. So this is far more profound than just any technology that we've had in the past. So like, I guess like our case here, I mean, we're mostly convinced on this. We think there is some uncertainty about it. But the case here is just, well, what are there like alternative models that could somehow rescue the view that AI is a more normal, boring technology? Or are we really just going to see this profoundly accelerated growth in terms of technological progress and economic growth? Anyway, so that's, I think, probably one of the most important things, is just how big of a deal is AI? How can we know? How can we like collect evidence on this? But you might also be convinced by that. Like if you're showing up to this talk, you might think AI is a super big deal already. So then there's like other questions. So how is progress made in AI? So like what are the things that drive progress? And there's been a lot of recent work in the last few years on that is making tractable progress answering this question. And in particular, there's this work on scaling laws, which I'm sure many people are familiar with. Essentially, we have these empirical laws that tell us that if we have certain inputs, like parameter count of the model and data, then we can actually predict the performance of the model. And then in addition, you might think that, and in fact there are these hard to measure factors which determine performance, which you can roughly call algorithmic progress. So this is just anything that's able to improve the performance of models in AI that is not explained by just increasing parameter count, increasing data, or increasing the compute that's used to train these large language models and multimodal models. So one big question is, how big of a deal, like what is the relative contribution of the scaling laws, like the hardware scaling, and the software progress or algorithmic progress? So like, is AI progress mainly driven by people just coming up with new insights, like, sitting down in a room and thinking really hard about how to make AI more efficient? Or is it mainly driven by just having like much larger training runs than we have before? And so our general impression, based on like our empirical research of trying to collect data on this phenomenon, which, because it's in this precise framework that was made amenable to analysis as a result of scaling laws, we can actually try to precisely measure this question, and we have to some degree, and it seems that it's roughly half of the progress in the field of AI is coming from just making models much larger and training them for longer, and then the other half seems to come from algorithmic progress. But we don't have like solid data on this. Like in particular, most of the data, long-run data, is just for progress on ImageNet, which is like widely used data set for image classification, like image processing. But the data for language modeling is much less complete. And so we still have many unanswered questions. Like we don't really know to what extent is like progress just driven by people making their models larger. And I should say that this is a harder question than you might think, because people who contribute ideas to the field, like who publish papers saying, my new approach improves on the state of the art. You might think that we could just look at that and see, so that idea contributes so-and-so to progress in the field. But the problem is that for like most of the history of AI, and still now, people haven't been very rigorous about actually testing, well, how important was my contribution? Like, yes, they got a better, state-of-the-art, or they did better than the previous state-of-the-art on ImageNet. But do we know that that was because of their specific contribution, or was it actually some other factor? So these things make these questions much harder than you might otherwise realize, than you might otherwise think. But we still think that it's relatively tractable if you just collect enough data, think hard enough about it. Another question, which I think is personally very important, is the ubiquity of transfer learning. So transfer learning refers to the ability for a model or a person to leverage their knowledge in order to learn a new task. So for example, if you learn physics, then maybe it'll be easier for you to learn chemistry. I mean, that would be intuitive. We see the same thing in AI, which is like if you train an AI model on English, then that also allows it to learn Python, like the computer programming language, much more easily. So there seems to be some underlying structure in Python, which is shared with English, which allows you to actually like transfer knowledge between the two tasks. So why is this important? I think it's important because we've demonstrated, like there was a paper from OpenAI a few years ago that demonstrated this, that as our models get larger, or have gotten larger, the ability to leverage transfer learning is growing. And this is actually, you can actually precisely characterize this. So the larger models are able to leverage transfer learning more efficiently. So one thing that you can draw from this is possibly this indicates that this trend of larger and larger models, like as we're investing more into training AI models on larger data sets, this will mean that it will be continuously get easier for the models to learn new modalities. So just to give one example for why this might be useful, a pretty big example, is the example of robots. So a lot of people that I talk to think that progress in robots has been very slow, and that seems to be my impression too. Like relative to progress in LLMs, like large language models, the progress in robots is quite abysmal. Like we have these Boston Dynamics demos that come out, but it never actually is like Like when you actually look into it, the robots tend to be very brittle. They tend to be not the type of things that can replace, human labor. And so, but suppose that transfer learning enables you to just leverage knowledge more efficiently from other modalities into the real world. So, for example, if you train an agent in simulation, maybe if you just make the model large enough, then it will just very efficiently be able to transfer the knowledge that it learned in simulation into the real world. And so this would indicate that in a similar way that large language models have recently been very successful, maybe we'll just see a very similar thing in robotics in like the coming 5 years. People will just think, oh, it turns out that this scaling hypothesis, the idea that we can just make AI work if we just scale it up, it also applies to the idea of robots as well. And then just like, maybe it applies to everything. So the question of whether this actually works, though, depends very highly on the exact structure of these scaling laws for transfer, which the important thing about that is that these are measurable. And so when we're currently trying to measure them at epoch, so depending on the results, this can actually tell us quite a lot about whether we're going to plausibly have huge success in the field of general purpose robotics in the next few years, or whether it'll just take many decades, because that's also possible. So I don't know. But I would certainly like to see more work done on this. So another thing that is frequently debated, but often in very informal terms, is just exactly what AI takeoff will look like. So AI takeoff is also often defined as like what will be the dynamics of the world once we've reached artificial general intelligence, or something, something that can substitute for human labor, something that's as smart as a human, whatever. So after that happens, what happens next? Okay, so like there's lots of theories that people have about this. So people will be categorized into like a few different camps, in my experience. You have people who believe in slow takeoff, which is, after AGI it'll take a long time, because there'll be like diminishing returns, and maybe we need like so much data to train anything better than humans. That it'll take a very long time to get to superintelligence. So we should expect that to be very far away, even if we think AGI is close. On the other hand, you could think, no, there are these feedback loops. Like how I said earlier, how if AI can substitute for human labor, then plausibly that just speeds everything up, because you can have AI researchers be the AIs. And so like currently, maybe the reason why AI progress is the rate at which it is just because there's a limited number of human researchers. There's a limited number of people who can like work on semiconductor fabs. And so if you can lift that bottleneck, then you can actually have much faster progress. So one question here that is very informative is, can we actually for testing whether these two views are, like which one is true, is what are the actual returns to research and development? So like if you hire 10 AI researchers, what return do you usually get? And compared to if you hired 1,000. And so this is something we can really try to get empirical data on. People haven't done this for AI research necessarily, but economists have done this for scientific research in general. And so people have come up with different estimates. And so like there was a quite famous paper in, I think, 2020 that was about whether ideas are getting harder to find. And so they showed that if in science in general, in like the last century, science has basically slowed down, like according to some of the best measures. Like science was faster probably 70 years ago than it is now, like scientific progress and technological progress, even though the workforce of scientists, like the number of researchers who work in labs, has exploded dramatically. The amount of funding that goes into science has exploded dramatically. And so plausibly, and this is the way that most people interpret this, which is that there's just these steep diminishing returns to spending money on scientific research. And so maybe this is what makes AI take off slow. It's like even if you have so many AIs, doing AI research, maybe that just slows down everything and means that you get this long takeoff. But it turns out that at least in our analyses, the parameters, like the level of diminishing returns that you would need in order for this to be true, in order to get a slow takeoff, are just much different than the empirical values that economists have so far discovered. And so the primary result from our preliminary analyses are that no, this is not likely to bottleneck AI, even though there are such steep, like even if you just take these results at face values, there are very steep diminishing returns to scientific research effort, but they're just surprisingly smaller than the actual degree to which you can imagine the AI labor supply growing, because the AI labor supply depends on how quickly you can manufacture new hardware and how much more efficiently you can make the AIs. Like in 1 year, maybe the AIs require a supercomputer to run, and then the next year they'll require a smaller supercomputer to run. So if you just really look at this analysis carefully, our rough guess is that we'll have a pretty fast takeoff. Like after AGI, it'll be maybe just a few years before the world is radically transformed. And so that seems like a really important thing to know. Like personally, I like going into it, I was much more uncertain. I thought that maybe, because we had all these results that say science is slowing down, that maybe the results wouldn't turn out this way. But what I'm saying is, according to the best research we know of, it looks like that's not true. The other thing is just, how concentrated will AI development be? So, like, will there just be one firm developing the best AIs? Like right now, there's only really, like a few companies that have models that are comparable to, or that have developed models that are comparable to GPT-4. So this could indicate that this is what's going to be true in the future, like indefinitely. Like some people in the past historically had a view that AI would be very decentralized, that it would just be like a bunch of researchers developing their own AIs or different small labs. But it seems that the evidence from the fact that there's these scaling laws that say that if you just put more money into hardware, then you can get out better AI. What if the effective result is that there's very steep economies of scale. And so personally, I expect this to just continue. Like, I think that AI developments will be very concentrated in the future. And like one plausible consequence of that is that the government will take over. If like society doesn't trust the 1 or 2 or 3 firms that are developing these frontier AIs, then maybe we'll just have the government take over. So like measuring the economies of scale here are incredibly important, because I think it is important to know whether we'll just have the government take over everything. And the point I want to emphasize here is that you can, like, I can't explain everything here, but you can really analyze this in like an economic framework, and you can try to get the best evidence rigorously about what are the economies of scale of AI. Like, do we actually have reasons to think that the development will be highly concentrated? And not just the development, but there's like particular facts about GPUs that mean that it's hard to like you can't utilize one GPU very easily like one H100 GPU to run GPT-4. So you generally need like a lot of instances of GPT-4 running simultaneously in parallel across like many GPUs. This is just related to the fact that there's a very heavy imbalance between the number of arithmetic operations that you can do on a GPU versus the amount of memory that you can move in a given unit of time. Anyway, but this also means that inference, like people using AIs, may be very centralized. So like there's a lot of people who think we'll have like open source AIs and everyone will have their own AI. I'm kind of skeptical of this. Like I think maybe it'll be more like everyone's renting an AI from the same 5 distributors. So that's also a way that it could be very centralized. And I think that, yeah, these things are things that can be and like have been analyzed rigorously, but not a lot of attention has gone into analyzing them rigorously, except for people who follow Epoch, I guess. And, well, there's a few other sources. Anyway, but personally, like one of the most important questions, obviously, is just when is this all going to happen? Like when are we going to experience this dramatic acceleration of the economic growth rate? Or like, you know, when am I going to lose my job? You know, people want to know that. And so it is very important to try to get a model of like, well, how fast, like, can we actually measure how the capabilities of current models and like put that on a graph and try to extrapolate that and see like, you know, when do we hit some sort of milestone? When do we hit these like crucial abilities? Like when will we get to AGI? And so I think this comes down to partly a matter of designing better benchmarks. So like being able to measure the capabilities of AI better. And so like there's currently 2 camps, or like, you know, a lot of these things are in camps. There's a lot of approaches that people have had towards this. Some people say, it's useless to try to forecast AI because actually, like, abilities will just emerge suddenly. Like, you know, if we have no idea when abilities will emerge. All we know is that they might emerge at some scale. On the other hand, there's people who say no. Like, you know, there's like particularly, there was a paper that was released, I think, like last year, although I could be mistaken about that, showing that on like these various benchmarks that you would go from having almost no capability to do some tasks, say arithmetic, like, you know, 2-digit multiplication, to suddenly the model would very easily be able to do that task just because you scaled it a little bit further. And so this provides reason to think that these things are inherently unpredictable. But then more recently, some people have pushed back against that by saying, well, the only reason why these things look unpredictable is because you're not measuring it correctly. So if you measured the capabilities in this alternative way, then you'd see that the increase is actually more gradual. So I think this is an empirical question that can be tested. How predictable are these abilities? Like at Epoch, we intend to actually try to just extrapolate current capabilities and then come out with predictions. Like this is our best guess at what scale these capabilities can emerge. Unfortunately, we haven't done that yet, just because it's very hard to actually get good benchmarks. So, but if we get like good ways of measuring the capabilities of these models, then I think that would be enormously valuable. So we are trying to work on that. So that's not like an answer to the question of when will this all happen. More of just like an answer of like how you could figure it out and why it's tractable. Like, and if you're interested in knowing the answer, then you should probably look at Epoch, maybe even work with us. My best guess is that these things are just happening much more rapidly than people thought, and that will just probably continue. Given the fact that approximately 50% of progress seems to be coming from scaling, there's a lot of room that, for these systems to just scale much further. So currently, companies are spending on the order of hundreds of millions of dollars, maybe even $1 billion on frontier AI research. But when you compare that to the largest projects in history, that's much smaller. And also, if this is actually something that is going to dramatically accelerate GDP, then it's not unimaginable that we might be spending a large fraction of our GDP on just doing AI. And so that would indicate that there's orders of magnitude left for us to scale. So we maybe this year we're spending 10 billion or 1 billion. Companies are like spending 1 billion each. But then maybe 2 years from now it becomes 10 billion, and then 100 billion, and then 1 trillion. And I wouldn't find that surprising if there were commensurate returns. Like if it was true that you can now automate labor, or automate a large fraction of labor by doing much larger training runs, then there will be a strong economic incentive to do it. And so a large amount of whether AI is very soon hinges on these returns to scale. And so anyway, my best guess is that the returns to scale are quite high. So AI will probably arrive soon, like 5 to 15 years, maybe even shorter. I'm not sure. But I know that that's this is controversial, and so I am not highly confident about that. But I am excited about people looking into making and trying to measure this more precisely, so that maybe we can be, so that we're not caught off guard like we have been in the last 2 years, where forecasters were asked to forecast progress along a few benchmarks. Like there was this mathematics benchmark, there was a benchmark for high school and college exams, and my rough impression was that vast majority of forecasters just didn't anticipate that progress in natural language processing would be so fast. So it would be great to avoid that again, so that we can actually know what we're getting into in the next few years. I mean, obviously, it would be great from a policy perspective for us to not be caught by surprise, especially if we're caught by surprise in a way that is very dangerous. Like we suddenly get very capable models that can kill people and maybe kill everyone. So of course, I don't have conclusions. I just have the various, I just have this set of questions, and I'm proposing that there are quite rigorous ways of studying these questions. And it's also just extremely interesting stuff to study. So I encourage you to maybe look into it. I guess I don't have a call to action, to be honest. But to the extent I have a call to action, it's more if you're interested in building these rigorous models, then maybe talk to me and maybe think of collaborating with Epoch, and then we can discuss. Maybe you think something I said was completely wrong, and then we could talk about that. Anyway, that was my talk. I mean, yeah, does anyone want? Sure.
One of the things I'm really worried about is very large, kind of unprecedented jumps in algorithmic progress. Have you thought about what kind of distribution they might have in the future?
Yes. So that is an important thing. So that is very intricately linked with our research on algorithmic progress in general. If you can do the attribution of how much progress has been algorithmic and how much has been due to scale, you can also just try to look at over time. How much algorithmic progress have we made at various points in time, and were there some periods in time in which we made sudden jumps of progress? So we have actually looked into that. I mean, another thing that informs this is that like you could also just look at base rates. Like, what is the base rates of different of sudden breakthroughs in technologies? My general impression is from both of these lines of research is that the base rate is low, but there's still like a substantial chance that we could have sudden improvements. So I would maybe say 20% chance, but it depends a lot on the details. I don't have the data here right now.
Question. Can you correlate current hardware development speed up with end results? So even if you look at current generation of GPUs, they are not necessarily optimized for LLMs. I would argue they're more optimized for DLRMs. Today, your memory domain is what, 640 gig. Next year is going to be 256 times that, right?
Yep.
So you can easily load 100 trillion model end of next year. What can we do with that?
Sorry, what is your question? Will we be able to train a much larger model?
Oh, no, we will, for sure.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
Question, what's going to be the result and acceleration of that?
What's going to be the result of doing the training? Or like...
No, having the ability to train much larger models in much shorter time, because hardware is just much better.
I mean, I think what the... I mean, I don't know for sure. I'm also not like really a hardware person, but I would assume that that this will just continue progress at its current rapid pace. So like this is what will probably sustain our current rate of progress is the fact that we'll have more specialization for hardware so that it'll be much more efficient to train these large language models. And then, of course, that's in addition to the progress that we'll make on the software end. And so my guess would be the end result will be, well, we're going to see quite rapid progress in the next few years. It's not just going to like slow down. That is, I would bet on that. Mm-hmm.
One short question. Do you see brute force development, something that we are going to see in the next couple of years? So larger models, more parameters, more hardware?
Yeah. I expect that, and one of the things that informs this is just that, one of the things that Epoch is best known for is we have this data series on what is the amount of compute that was used for milestone AI training runs, and the long run trend is that we just keep increasing the training size of these models, and like in particular in the last 10 years. The rate of growth in like how much compute we're using for these like large model training runs and how large the models are is increasing extremely rapidly. So this will like the fact that we're getting better and more specialized hardware will we'll probably be able to sustain that for some time. Thank you.
What, in your opinion, are the best actions an average person could take in A, let's say the next week, and B, with their career to nudge the expected outcomes of this progress in a positive direction?
Well, I think I'd have to ask what the person's talents are. I mean, just generalist, I don't have much of an idea about what the best person or like what any person could do. But I would just, if I have to be very general, then I would say, well, you should take a look at this AI thing, because there's this very big deal that it's going to that it could totally reshape our world within 10 years. And so, like, if you're making like plans that are that implicitly assume that the world will be roughly the same in like 10 years, then you should probably take this into consideration. Now, in terms of making the world better, I mean, I would like more people to do the type of work that Epoch does. Like if they have a talent for that. I'd also like more people to be interested in or like to do AI safety work. Also, people just like what is the best way of managing AI in terms of governance and policy. I mean, if someone is like particularly talented at that, then I would really want a lot more people to be working on that. Yeah.
I'm a little bit confused about this thing about things that seem to be discontinuous jumps actually being smoother or something like that. And possibly I'm just not understanding, but it seems to me the benchmarks are designed to be close proxies for things we care about, right? Like performance on tasks that we're trying to get AI systems to do. And so if there's a discontinuous jump there, or at least a sharp jump, let's say, then that happens at performance at the real world task and the economic impact and so on. So what's the... And on the other hand, gradient descent, like, it's working in tiny steps. So it seems obvious to me that nothing truly discontinuous can be happening, right? There will be some metric whereby this is a smooth and gradual change. So what's the... Like, why is this not trivial or something? Like, what's the benefit of this?
Well, good question. So the reason why it's not trivial is, first of all, there's two questions that are important. Is the increase in performance sudden, like in terms of discontinuous? The second thing is it predictable? Like, can we know at what scale will it jump up suddenly? And so the point of having these alternative ways of measuring it is important, because then maybe that can allow us to predict at what point it'll suddenly scale up. The second thing I'd like to say is that you might imagine that, well, there's some tasks at which we'll get sudden jumps, but maybe in terms of like the economic importance, maybe what matters more is not like whether particular tasks will see sudden jumps, but more of like the average over a set of, like a very large set of relevant tasks. And then it's potentially feasible that the average over this large set of tasks would be much smoother than any individual task.
Right. Okay. So the claim is not just that there exist, that you can find post hoc metrics that vary smoothly, but that you could know them ahead of time and use them to predict things that would otherwise seem to be jumps.
I mean, that's the hypothesis. Okay. I don't know if like anyone has explicitly claimed that yet, but I think that people think that it is probably true, but it like hasn't been proven yet. And like, so that's why I would really like to actually show it in like having an analysis where you can say this is the level at which we expect these capabilities, and then it, and then we can actually see whether in the future those capabilities arise at that level.
Big if true. Yeah.
Yeah, that's right.
I was wondering if you could speak a little bit more to like what does algorithmic progress look like, and like what does that usually like consist of? Is something like chinchilla, like discovering chinchilla scaling law, like instead of what they were doing before that, like count as like algorithmic progress? Is that something different? And like, what are like the biggest components of that?
Well, unfortunately, I can't give too good of an answer to this, because it's kind of the same way that economists think about technological progress. So the way that economists think of technological progress is like, well, it's the stuff that's not accounted for, or like it's the stuff that increases output after we've accounted for all the measurable things. And then it's like, so by definition, it's kind of unmeasurable. And so in the same way, algorithmic progress is kind of unmeasurable. It's like, well, it's the increase in efficiency after we've accounted for like all the known ways by which you could make models more efficient. And so presumably that includes things like being able to get a better scaling law, because now like the chinchilla scaling law allowed people to take to know like, oh, I can do better with the compute resources that I currently have, because I can make my models smaller and train them for longer, and that means that I can use my compute more efficiently. So I would count that as algorithmic progress if you're just measuring algorithmic progress in compute. But then if you have this measure of algorithmic progress where you say, well, algorithmic progress in terms of some other thing like token seen or and parameter size, then it's a little more tricky. But yeah, it's very difficult to say exactly what is algorithmic progress, other than researchers are making their systems more efficient, and we don't know why. Like they're making them more efficient in a way that's hard to measure. So all of the ways that they're doing that is algorithmic progress.
All right, cool. That makes sense. So I would say that it's a little bit easier than the economy, because like you can't really, like rerun the economy with like taking out this piece of technology or taking out that piece of technology. Like I think you could, like, in the like real economy, if you could just like rerun a couple of decades while like turning on or off the inventions of new technology, then you could get like a much better proxy for like what economic growth is made out of, but we can't.
Oh, I totally agree. And like, I am surprised that like there hasn't been anyone who's done this before, like checking to see rigorously, like how much of a difference did the transformer make? And like, looking at a list of innovations, I hear a lot of people talking about this and like this comes up repeatedly, but like, I haven't seen anyone do it yet. Some people at Epoch might do it. So we'll have to see. All right. Well, we're close to the end anyway. I mean, I think it actually is the end, so I think this will be the last question. Okay. Then that's great.
Okay. Can I ask this last question? Or?
Yeah.
Okay. Are you also looking into forecasting alignment progress?
Yeah, I mean, that's a lot harder, though. Like, it's harder to know how you do that. So I guess, like, I mean, we're interested in forecasting anything really that's relevant to the future of AI, but like I don't think we have a good angle on that yet because it's such a hard question to know. Are we getting better at aligning our models? I think in some sense we are. I mean, like I think this in like an uncontroversial way we are, which is that like GPT-4 certainly is like more aligned in the sense of being more useful than like GPT-2 was. But is that like really alignment or is that capabilities? So most people would. I mean, most like alignment researchers would say, no, that's like probably just, we should just call that capabilities. Like true alignment is whether you can make sure the system isn't deceptive or something, So in that sense, it's very hard to get an angle on how to actually forecast whether we're making progress. So I would say, well, I'd love to touch this question, but I don't know how to. Cool. Thanks a lot, everyone.